If you follow the conspiracy world, you have no doubt heard of the machine elves. I know we have covered them before in previous videos, and basically, they're supposed to be these beings that are seen by people who ingest a psychedelic drug known as DMT. They are unsurprisingly usually described as looking like elves, but sometimes they are described as being alien, or looking like a mantis-type being. Actually, there's a ton of different descriptions, as it all depends on the person witnessing them, and they are often just watching you, although sometimes they do try to communicate, maybe offering wise words, or in some accounts, just being humorous. And depending on which source you believe, you're either just experiencing hallucinations, or, as the bigger conspiracy suggests, actually entering another dimension or plane of existence, where these humanoid-type beings exist. A dimension that can only be unlocked by taking DMT, which allegedly alters the brain's filters that limit perception of the physical world. Now that conspiracy is pretty well known, largely thanks to the research of Terence McKenna in the 90s, but it really got popular in the 2010s thanks to podcasts like Joe Rogan. But in this series, we take a look at the crazier, less known theories, and in this case, the theory we're going to look at is, what if DMT is not opening up your mind to allow you into another dimension, but instead allows us to see into a universal consciousness field? For example, if every human on Earth was mentally connected to a field of energy, and it's where we store our experiences, emotions, and knowledge, then would it be possible that DMT could basically mute a person's individual perspective for a short time, thus allowing the brain to tune into this universal shared consciousness, which would mean that it is neither a hallucination nor beings from an alternate dimension, but instead, you are seeing the fragments of memories, ideas, emotions, or knowledge from people all over the world, albeit the drug would only work temporarily, stopping you from really exploring this shared consciousness. And I know you may be thinking, this is total bunk and stupid to even suggest, but this actually piggybacks off a theory of the famous Carl Jung, the founder of the School of Analytical Psychology, who suggested a term called collective unconscious, which is basically a concept that the unconscious mind contains ideas that are shared by everyone in the world. The most basic one of these is instinct, things like survival, fear, the bond between a mother and child, fight or flight. All of these, according to Jung, are examples of a shared consciousness, but there's examples that are more complex than instinct, like the old wise man archetype, the kind and wise elderly father figure of the village or town, who shares knowledge with everyone and often offers advice to someone in need, a character like Merlin or Gandalf. This character does not belong to any one culture. Instead, all of them have a version of the wise old man archetype. Even pre-Columbian contact cultures, who had never met a European before, had their own version of the wise old man. So Jung reasoned, how could every culture group on Earth, who in many cases had no contact with other cultures, still have the same types of stories and characters? Because it wasn't just the wise old man story. Another archetype is the tree of life. This again is shared by numerous religions and cultures all over the world. A tree of knowledge, or tree of knowledge of good and evil, or tree of life, etc. Because of all this, Jung believed there was an unconscious layer of the human psyche that transcended cultural differences. So with that, let's go back to the DMT elves being connected to this shared consciousness. If Jung is right with his theory, then it is perhaps possible that DMT allows you to basically see someone else's thoughts, enter their mind, perhaps even view reality through their eyes. And if that is true, then it means human consciousness might be just one node in this huge network of awareness that connects us all. And it's certain psychedelics that can crack through this wall only for a short time and let us view inside. The theory further elaborates that if certain groups, aka the shadow organizations or government, knew how to manipulate this field of consciousness, then it would be super easy to influence thought. It could even explain things like mass hysteria, or perhaps the suppression of ideas that would benefit mankind, which might explain why psychedelics are illegal in most places. When it comes to secret bases inside the United States, there are none bigger than Area 51. It's a highly classified detachment ran by the Edwards Air Force Base in Nevada. and has been around since the 1950s. And while it's largely thought that the base is basically nothing more than a testing ground for new weapons and aircraft, it hasn't stopped conspiracy theorists who over the years have made guesses on what's really going on there. But what if I was to tell you that, despite Area 51's reputation, there is possibly another base that outdoes it in every way? That brings us to Dulce Base in Dulce, New Mexico, along the Colorado border. If you have never heard of this base, don't feel bad, because most haven't, and that's because it probably doesn't exist, which is the conspiracy itself. The whole compound is said to exist completely underground and is a jointly operated facility ran by humans and aliens. See, this all began in 1979 when a Paul Benowitz, a businessman from Albuquerque, began claiming he was intercepting electronic communications between an underground base somewhere he had not identified yet and UFOs. But he would eventually locate the site of this base, somewhere in Dulce, and since Paul was already a big name in the UFO world, having been an investigator during the 70s, this was considered big news in the UFO world, because according to Paul, it all started that July when he started filming strange lights and picked up the unusual radio signals over Kirtland Air Base in Albuquerque. Now there's a lot to this story, and I won't dive into all the particulars, but basically, the story kind of spun out of control and eventually brought in abduction accounts, UFO sightings, and cattle mutilations. But I want to concentrate on the structure itself. Dulce was said to be broken up into 7 different levels underground, the first being the security area, second level being human housing, third being the control and surveillance floor. The fourth layer is where the restrictions start, where the humans who have top secret clearance can go, and requires alien approval. The fifth level is where alien housing and communications were carried out, and I should probably remind you here that the aliens were often seen working together with the human researchers, although this relationship was described as uneasy. Dropping down to layer 6, you get the infamous Nightmare Hall. Here it was said that genetic experiments described as grotesque were carried out. In particular, alleged witnesses who had gotten access, or were former employees, claimed that in these areas you could find disembodied human limbs, as well as creatures that looked like they belonged in a horror novel. These were often kept suspended in a gel-like fluid, and of course, human-alien hybrids. But how did they get these hybrids? That's the dark and interesting part. The humans were often test subjects who had their genetic material cloned or spliced to then cross over with aliens. But are the test subjects there voluntarily? That would be a no. These are people that have been abducted and can consist of military personnel and civilians, where they are imprisoned, waiting their turn for experimentation. Now, not all of these humans are used for cloning or the mixing of species. Some of them are used to test certain viruses and pathogens on them, basically bioweapons research. And suffice to say, many of the humans employed here allegedly had no idea this stuff was going on. But the final level is 7, where the most sensitive materials are kept. It's here you will find large cryogenic freezers for all the genetic material stored. Some sources say there's even a giant incinerator here to destroy the failed experiments. Now I would tend to think that even in the conspiracy world, most of us would agree that all this is totally ridiculous and not believable at all. And there might be a reason for that, and that's the real conspiracy here. Because a man named Richard Doty, a confirmed former special agent within the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, later claimed that he intentionally gave Paul Benowitz a lot of this false information, as it was part of his job duties. See, when Benowitz had made contact with Richard, that really made him feel like he had a special link behind the veil of secrecy inside the government, who could tell him about UFOs, and this naturally excited him. So Richard went along with Paul's ridiculous claims of the underground bunker and the so-called Nightmare Hall, and not only that, he made up fictional documents that he then pretended to sneak out and give to him as evidence, which only further reinforced his beliefs that he was onto something. But Richard wasn't done. He even took it a step further and encouraged Paul to expand his theories to the point they reached levels of complete absurdities that would bring us the underground base known as Dulce. And after a while, even the UFO community began to doubt Paul's claims, which might have been the goal all along. Another UFO researcher, Bill Moore, would later even confess to the UFO community that he had been working with Richard to manipulate Benowitz to try and destroy his reputation, although he claimed he had only been doing this because he had been coerced to do so. And before long, other UFO researchers cut all ties with Benowitz, and he soon became isolated, and his mental health took a serious toll, and he ended up in a mental facility for a while. And some have argued that was the government's objective all along. But why target Paul? That's the real question. Most believe now that, although his claims, which were encouraged by the government, were absolutely false, they could have been hiding something else. Could it have been highly classified programs at the nearby Kirtland Air Force Base, where Paul had been monitoring radio signals and was causing issues for them? Maybe he was inadvertently exposing secret military operations, or maybe they were just using Paul as a stooge to take attention away from these very real projects, or as some suggest, it was actually nothing more than a chance to study how a disinformation campaign could work perfectly. Although there is a lot that Americans in recent years are divided on, one thing that has always garnered support of the majority of Americans is our national parks. Depending on the poll, 75 to 80% of Americans on both sides of the political aisle love the park system, while around 66% believe the park should be a top priority and should receive more funding. And it's easy to see why that is. These parks often encapsulate some of the most beautiful parts of the country. And even if you're not a camper, hiker, or outdoorsman, there's not many who don't appreciate the beauty and serenity of nature. But if you are someone that frequents the parks, you will have no doubt went one day planning to go on a hike only to find out a certain part of the trail had been closed, or that certain parts of the park are completely shut down for maintenance. Heck, sometimes the entire park itself might be closed due to maintenance, or because they don't have the money and the required staff to do such maintenance. But what if there is a darker reason why these areas of the park are shut down so often? And no, I'm not talking about David Pilatus here. The first national park in the world came about in 1872, when the Yellowstone National Park Act was signed, and a little over 40 years later, the National Park Service, a bureau of the federal government, came into existence, with the stated goal to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife there within, and to provide there for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Of course, according to this conspiracy, that is only the cover for what the National Park Service is really up to. First, look at the terrain of these places. It's often in these remote areas where the land is rugged and heavily forested. Sometimes it's nothing but mountains. Now let's take a look at some American cryptids like Bigfoot, Mothman, Skinwalkers, Wendigo, etc. Have you ever noticed, in almost every story concerning them, they are usually seen in those same types of terrain? Heck, a good portion of the reported sightings occur in national parks. Let's take the Patterson-Gimlin film for example, maybe the most famous cryptid footage in the world. Where was it taken? Six Rivers National Forest in California. The Pacific Northwest in general has become known as a beacon for Bigfoot sightings, along with Mount Rainier and Olympic National Park, which have their own unexplained phenomena. It kind of makes sense too. These regions will provide the best cover for these animals as well. With all the natural barriers, the parks would almost act like fences that the cryptids knew not to leave, thus limiting their exposure to humans. But circling back to the main part of this conspiracy, what's the deal with them having closed off areas so often? Of course, they typically say it's to do maintenance, or wildlife management, or sometimes due to wildfires. But what if these closures are just a cover for the National Park Service, or some other organization, to go in and deal with different types of supernatural phenomena? For example, a wildfire might actually be a controlled burn to eradicate cryptid nests. Or is it possible that an area shut down for bear activity is actually code for an increase in sightings for these creatures that are not yet publicly acknowledged? Is this nothing more than a way for the government to deal with these entities without alerting the public? Or let's say there's an uptick in Bigfoot sightings in one park. That park could then be closed for a wildlife management day as a way for the authorities to track down and relocate the cryptids in secret, or perhaps deal with them in more lethal ways. Then afterwards, they go about removing tracks, nests, and remains, and/or send them to secret labs to be studied. There could even be preventive maintenance windows when the park is always shut down at certain times of the year because they know when a particular cryptid is on the move or going to be spotted more often, or perhaps maybe at times of the year when unexplained phenomena spikes, like UFO sightings. While we're on the subject, have you ever noticed that although the parks are absolutely huge, very little is done when making it accessible? Instead, there are usually a few campsites, hiking trails, and recreational facilities. The rest of the park could only be reached by going off trail through very difficult terrain just to see it. The skeptic will claim that's because they are trying to keep the park's nature as pristine as possible. But believers in this conspiracy suggest this is done to show that the parks are technically open to the public, but they know the vast majority of people are not going to be physically fit enough to actually make it into these areas where these things may be. And I know I said this was not a Dave Pilatus conspiracy, but the 411 mystery does connect, because some people believe that the strange disappearances in these national parks are because of all these said cryptids, who would often leave no trace of a person. But maybe they're doing it for territorial reasons, or food, or simple curiosity. The point is, they're behind it. Others believe that the national parks act as hotspots for interdimensional portals, where people might be stepping into them accidentally and vanishing completely. And again, the government knows all this and is actively covering it up, so tourism to these parks will continue to thrive. When it comes to the origin of life on Earth, many theories have been proposed, but maybe none as famous as Panspermia, which states that life originated elsewhere in the universe and arrived to Earth via space dust, meteoroid, asteroids, and comets. This life would have been things like microbes that could survive in space, like bacteria, and once the space debris crashed into Earth and shattered into pieces, spores would be spread, and in 1,000,000 years or so, life would begin to take on more complex forms. And that's all pretty well known, but to scientists, it's nothing more than a fringe theory. But to this next conspiracy theory, Panspermia is not only the real way life on Earth began, but it was intentional. According to the ones that believe this theory, Panspermia was not accidental, as some claim, and instead, it was an intentional act by a very advanced species, who were trying to seed random planets. So they began scanning the cosmos for planets that could potentially sustain life and began bombarding them with microorganisms to see which would be capable of evolving into intelligent beings. And that's where the second part of this conspiracy comes in, the sentience sonar. See, once these microbes travel across distant galaxies, crash land on a planet, and then wake up and begin evolving, over time, some kind of intelligent life would emerge and become the dominant species on the planet, not unlike Earth. Then this species, if it kept advancing as it should, would become a spacefaring species. And once that point emerges, then they, or in this case, us, would begin unintentionally sending signals into space, which would eventually make it back to the alien species who seeded the planet in the first place, and thereby alerting them of a habitable planet. This, of course, would take millions of years to all play out, but doing this to tens of thousands or even millions of planets would result in multiple hits, and would sort of be like sonar, hence the theory name. Of course, the question then becomes, why would they even bother doing this? And that's where the theory splits off into a few different directions. Some speculate their civilization is dying, and they are hoping to spread life beyond their planet before it's too late. Or perhaps it is part of their ideological belief to seed the galaxy with life. Or maybe it's an attempt to create a universe of minds that could conceivably act as one in an attempt to achieve a higher cosmic goal. Or the whole thing may serve as some kind of research, and the inhabitants of these planets never know they are part of a larger study, regardless of which, once they began receiving signals from these different planets, whether that be radio waves or whatever, it would be like the cosmic version of an echo that an advanced civilization has developed, and it would confirm their efforts from over 1,000,000 years ago has succeeded. Alex Jones has been called many things: grifter, patriot, comedian, crazy man, but say what you want about him, he is able to get attention. And according to this next theory, that might have been the goal all along. Could it be that Jones' highly theatrical and hyperbolic ramblings, where he screams and makes some incredibly stupid claims, are nothing more than an agenda by the deep state to undermine the credibility of the very legitimate conspiracies, especially the ones that concern corruptions or the abuse of government powers. See, that's the theory here. Alex Jones, the conspiracy nut, is actually a performance artist that has long worked for the deep state, and that claim, that he is a performance artist, actually comes from a good source, Jones's own lawyer, who stated at his divorce hearing that Jones was simply putting on a show and basically mocking conspiracy theorists in the process by putting out dumber and dumber theories to see who all will fall for it, while at the same time completely tarnishing legit conspiracies and discouraging people from talking about them. This, of course, would be disputed by Jones on his own program later on, although at court he did say in general he agreed with his own lawyer, and Jones's supporters ever since have tried to claim he only said this so he would have split custody with his kids and so he wouldn't lose money. Although the counter-argument to that is, if he's willing to compromise on his so-called truthful statements that he's made in the past because he doesn't want to lose his money, then that means he's basically for sale and will say whatever someone tells him to say if the price is right. Which brings us back to the theory that he plays his part so perfectly that he has made anyone who believes conspiracies seem like unhinged people, and any of the genuine claims that Jones had brought up, like corruption or surveillance on its own people, gets drowned out by all of his stupid claims, which misleads his audience from those core things that he should really be concerned about. This also comes into play when you look at his social media bans. It's just possible the deep state ordered YouTube and the other platforms to ban him, and then using their own powers behind the scenes, kept Jones at his high-profile status, because instead of fading away once he was banned, he stayed relevant, and some might argue he got more popular, because his supporters believed, see, they wouldn't ban him if he wasn't exposing the real truth, while in reality, that was what the deep state planned all along. In fact, Bill Cooper, who many consider the first and true conspiracy theorist on radio, although he was doing his show on shortwave, claimed that after going on Alex Jones's show, he realized he was nothing more than a BS artist, showman, and coward. And when he figured out who Jones really was, he had nothing more to do with him, ignoring his calls and requests to come back onto the show. But we can take it a step further. All of Jones's legal battles, especially those involving Sandy Hook, has damaged not only Jones, but anyone who aligns themselves with the anti-establishment community, which some point out was the plan all along implemented by the deep state and then carried out perfectly by Jones, which means he is a great actor, maybe even trained by some of the finest teachers in the country. Is it possible he didn't attend a community college? Instead, he went to the Juilliard School of Acting, where he then made his deep state connection. All of this, of course, plays into the bigger picture. If Jones is controlled opposition, then any of these movements considered anti-establishment could also just be ran by the deep state, which of course means that any of these groups will have a harder time finding followers, since it is impossible to say which ones are compromised. Of course, maybe Alex Jones is just a grifter. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a very strange epidemic would pop up that still hasn't been fully explained to this day. Of course, I am talking about the dancing plague, which took place over a 3-month period between July and September. It started with a woman named Frau Trophia, who began dancing uncontrollably in the streets before dozens of other people joined her and then danced on for days, which then spiraled into a mass hysteria and caused more and more people to dance. And although this might sound harmless, it ended up causing some of the dancers to die from exhaustion or a heart attack or stroke. For centuries, historians have tried to assign different causes to what started it, like the eating of bread, which had the ergot fungus on it, or even due to some religious reasons. But what if there was a more evil reason? That brings us to the theory that the dancing plague was started by a memetic virus. And what is that, you might ask? You are no doubt already familiar with the term meme, which was coined by Richard Dawkins, and basically, it's just a unit of cultural information, like an idea, behavior, or style, that is then spread throughout a culture. Like an internet joke, we all know that's a meme, but so is fashion trends, urban legends, and even religious beliefs. So a memetic virus is the belief that these ideas and patterns are so contagious that they act like viruses that attack the mind instead of the body. So instead of having body aches from the flu, you instead get a song stuck in your head for days, and no matter what you do, it won't leave. This could be seen as a memetic infection. Or it's even possible you got wrapped up in the latest internet fad, like the Ice Bucket Challenge, which is so catchy that it infected the minds of millions of people simultaneously. Well, just like those examples, the dancing plague is the same. Frau Trophia was patient zero, and when she started dancing, the idea caught on, and soon, others could not resist but to dance with her, working sorta like a traditional virus that spreads through physical contact or droplets. Memetic viruses could even spread through simple interactions like watching someone perform the action, or even hearing a specific phrase. And this theory speculates that the dancing plague was one of the first, if not first, memetic viruses ever documented. Now, of course, like real viruses, it could have been a totally random event spawning up like real viruses do. But in our theory, it suggested that this was some kind of deliberate psychological attack by, you guessed it, one of those secret society groups of power. Which of course means, if this group was able to pull this off successfully centuries ago, is it still being done, and how? Well, of course, if the knowledge to pull this off has been recorded, you can almost bet someone behind the scenes is still releasing these viruses upon us. And how would they do it? Could it be different depending on each case? Could they engineer viruses for specific personalities? Or may even take time studying certain individuals' mental and emotional weaknesses and then creating viruses that would affect only people with certain traits. They could even attack people with high anxiety or that suffer from paranoia, and the virus would eventually cause them to spiral into madness. Or maybe you will find those who have a high level of empathy, making them more susceptible to a mass emotional virus. The scary part about this is, these weapons would be totally silent. There would be no way to trace down who fired it and when, and people who were exposed would not even know they were infected. Going back to the Ice Bucket Challenge, and what one might think is a harmless trend, could be the catalyst for spreading a mental virus. And before long, so many people are infected that you don't even notice the gradual change in behavior. Secret organizations could use this in so many destructive ways, like destabilizing whole societies or governments. They could cause mass hysteria, fear, and confusion, which of course would cause more panic and chaos. You could even create a virus to target specific political beliefs, to sway elections, and cause unrest. You could even say that misinformation campaigns that are used today are a form of memetic warfare, slowly infecting huge portions of the population. And of course, none of this could be easily stopped or cured, and the person could seemingly be manipulated in such a way to serve the interest of a powerful secret group for basically the rest of their lives. Unless, of course, someone, or a group of people, became aware of the viruses and created countermeasures, like some kind of memetic cure for the virus. And it's just as likely these secret societies are testing out several different types of viruses on different types of people, which they monitor over time and refine the formula before they release them on a large scale. When it comes to video games and conspiracies, there's not a lot that immediately pop to mind, but there are a couple of more famous ones that you have probably heard of. Maybe the biggest is that online video games are constantly monitored by various intelligence agencies around the world. And why would they do this? Well, for one, players often speak candidly during the in-game chats, and it gives an inside look to real unfiltered views as certain sensitive topics. Maybe topics that the governments feel are dangerous, which requires constant monitoring with the populace to make sure everyone stays in line. And considering that many video game lobbies connect players from all over the world, they would soon be able to notice patterns, not just from one country, but all over the world. Sensitive topics would no longer be a regional issue, but a global issue, one that they could study. You could even take it a step further and suggest that these agencies are watching how these players work together as a team, how they respond under stress, how they compete, which would also add more data to this eavesdropping. Which brings us to the next point, the legality of it. I was able to find that in the US at least, law enforcement cannot snoop on you directly without a warrant. However, in a public lobby, they are free to record as much as they want, which in many cases is quite a lot. So basically, the first part of the conspiracy suggests that the powers that be could now, in real time, monitor shifts in society before they happen and adjust accordingly, just by putting all this data together and analyzing trends. But this isn't the only big video game conspiracy. Another one that has been around for decades is the government uses violent video games to desensitize young players. That way, when they get older, they will join the military and become unquestioning killing machines who will make them much easier to control and keep them from asking questions on why they are involved in these wars that they themselves might find unjust. But it's this conspiracy that has been flipped around that we are going to discuss. Because in this one, the theory suggests that it's not the government pushing for all these video games to be more violent. Instead, it is the developers themselves doing it, but not for the obvious reason, not to make more money. Instead, it's alleged that these video games are made this way consciously or subconsciously to actually reduce fear in the populace, sorta as a way to counteract the government's attempts at scaring that same populace. By putting players in a game with tons of simulated violence, these players become more accustomed to the chaos and violent scenarios, and because of that, they lose their susceptibility to the government's attempts at scaring anyone with a terroristic threat. Because going back to another classic conspiracy, many governments use terrorism, or external threats, as an excuse to increase surveillance on its own citizens, or to make laws more restrictive. These games serve as a counterbalance to that, allowing people to emotionally disengage from it, because they've already seen these same scenarios play out dozens of times in a virtual environment. And since they have been in the same scenario so many times, they are far less likely to comply when governments overreach via using the same scenarios. Of course, the bigger question is, are the video game developers themselves really behind this move? Most likely not, since at the end of the day, they are just trying to make money. But it is possible that a secretive shadow group is. If we go back to the last video in this series, we discussed a conspiracy which suggested that numerous shadow groups behind the scenes are constantly at war with each other, trying to gain total power of the government and people. One of these groups may be on the good side, and are trying to help stop it, much like the Illuminati or the good guys theory we also looked at in the last video. Or it could be that just one of these groups is trying to throw a wrench into the plans of another, and they came up with a great way to desensitize people to terroristic threats. When it comes to the Titanic, there are numerous conspiracies involved. One of the biggest is that the Titanic never actually sunk, but instead was swapped out with its near-identical sister ship, the RMS Olympic, which then sunk in its place. But why in the world would this happen? According to the theory, the owners of the White Star Line ships, specifically a J. Bruce Ismay, orchestrated the whole plot as part of insurance fraud, because the Olympic had actually been in a collision with another ship just a year prior, and although it had substantial damage, it was repairable. But since these repairs were going to cost a ton of money, the company kept all that a secret and instead secretly altered it to look like the Titanic, and then it was purposely sent out knowing it would sink, and the company would inherit the insurance money. But what if there's a different reason, one that lies outside of Earth? Of course, I'm referring to aliens, who according to the theory, deliberately caused the sinking of the Titanic for one particular reason, to stop, or at the very least, slow down and prevent the building of superstructures, all for the reason that aliens have a vested interest in keeping humanity on a relatively small scale of technological advancement, because it is feared if we could progress at building superstructures, then at some point humanity could build a Dyson sphere, which is a hypothetical megastructure that encompasses a star and captures its power output, which of course could then be used for energy for space traveling, which of course means man could potentially begin expanding across the galaxy, and also means that the aliens would not be happy about it, and might be actively sabotaging these huge projects that are undertaken by us. Although, an alternate take on the theory is that aliens are our benevolent watchers who are trying to keep us on the planet until it's safe to leave. But back to the Titanic, it's not the only example, as history, according to the theory, has shown numerous times. Like the Hindenburg, it was the largest airship ever built at the time, and it actually led to a lot of talk about the future of long-distance travel, how it was going to change it all, and boom, The crash basically killed any future for airship travel, although it did not delay airplanes for very long. There's also Chernobyl, which again, according to the theory, was orchestrated by these alien beings to halt the advance of progressing too far with nuclear energy. Or what about the explosion of the Challenger space shuttle? Around that time, the idea of having more commercial and military trips into space was gaining momentum, and then this highly publicized mission would fail in front of the world, and basically did away with those ideas for the next couple of decades. Some even take the conspiracy all the way back to 48 BC, with the burning of the Library of Alexandria. What if it was not an accident, and instead caused by these same alien beings who wanted to set back the advance of humanity? It could explain why the expansion of the Roman Empire was met with very little technological advances, but how exactly are these alien beings pulling this off? That's another good question. For example, if we go back to the Titanic, it's possible that they were able to somehow get inside the ship, maybe even using a cloaking device which allowed them to move around unseen, and then tamper with the engine, or mess with the navigational system. Or heck, they could have even mastered weather control, which allowed them to move or alter the iceberg, making it more dangerous. There could have been multiple ways for them to pull stuff like this off. The Smithsonian Museum is actually a group of museums, 21 to be exact, along with 21 libraries, 14 education and research centers, a zoo, historical and architectural landmarks, along with 200 more institutions that are considered affiliates, and it was all created by the US government. Yet, it is not part of any of the 3 branches of government, but it is funded by them, along with much of the funding coming from private and corporate donations, as well as money they make off concessions and retail and the likes, since visiting is actually free, which goes along with its official stated goal to spread knowledge to America's citizens. Having said all that, some conspiracy theorists just don't buy it, and that's not really a surprise, is it? Because the Smithsonian, basically since its inception, has long been accused of hiding or destroying any kind of evidence that would discredit evolution, and to maintain the current narrative of human history. But why exactly is this a concern? Well, that goes back to what it is exactly that the Smithsonian is hiding. According to the theory, there have been numerous large human skeletons that would suggest giants once roamed the Earth, as well as some artifacts that suggest ancient civilizations were way more advanced than we give them credit for. See, it's these findings that would challenge the mainstream view that giants, divine beings, and/or very advanced cultures never existed. But why wouldn't a researcher who could possibly make one of the most important findings in history not want to document it? I mean, the legit discovery of a giant alone would basically make you rich, and your name would forever live on in history and archaeology. Well, of course, the reasons pitched is that the governments, or the secret powers that be, are threatening these archaeologists, or perhaps they are hiding and covering up any evidence themselves. But the reasoning is, if the public were able to find out that humanity is not the most advanced being on Earth, it could totally undermine governments, institutions, and authorities. Because, well, the confidence in them would no longer be the same. Because people would begin questioning the competence and legitimacy of the current system, especially if we found out there were superior civilizations and beings that came before us. It would also challenge many religions who all put humanity at the center of creation. It would force theologians to completely reevaluate religious texts and doctrines. And then, of course, history itself would have to be rewritten. That includes school books, historical accounts, as well as universities who would have to totally change their perspectives on civilizations and, yes, giants. So the only way out of this is to suppress the evidence. And institutions like the Smithsonian would be out in the very front, taking the lead, burying whatever goes against the narrative. Don't forget, we are the most important and advanced species on Earth. Nothing could come before us. And who can blame them for saying this? Because it's keeping the whole of our society together. This next one, I have to be a bit careful about, as I don't want the video to draw the ire of the YouTube gods. But you have probably heard the Comic-Con recruitment conspiracy, which basically alleges that numerous children disappear every year at Comic-Con, and they know this, but are being paid to keep quiet about it. Or the Comic-Con organizers are even complicit in their disappearances. In either case, it's because it's such a large event with tens of thousands of people visiting a year, that it's supposed to be an ideal venue for potential predators, or for people to even recruit them into cults, or any number of illegal activities, especially considering parents may be distracted by entertainment. And of course, like a lot of these theories, it's said some dark secret group is running this whole thing. The theory got really popular within the last decade, but like most conspiracies, there's no proof for it. But there may be a reason for that, and that is, the Comic-Con recruiting conspiracy was actually completely made up by this secret shadow group. Hence, it's a conspiracy about a conspiracy. Yes, according to this one, this whole unsettling theory was meant to scare parents into not going to Comic-Con. But not just that, the theory is even bigger. Think about the news. You have probably heard, if it bleeds, it leads, as it's very common the top news stories usually revolve around a grisly murder or gang violence or kidnappings. And you may think, well, that's our society. But what if it's not? What if some of this is manufactured and blasted onto our TVs and cell phones with the latest news of violence near you? What if all this constant crime-related stories, especially the ones involving children, are just a reminder to all of us that the world is a very dangerous place? The theory further states that not only does this help fuel the TV ratings, but a lot of these stories are selectively reported to push an agenda of fear, which of course means this secret shadow group is also controlling all the news stations. But why would they do this? Well, see, by amplifying fear of the outside world, people are more likely to just stay inside their homes, where they then become dependent on the internet for socialization and entertainment. Of course, this makes them even easier targets for online manipulation, which includes propaganda, advertising, and radicalization, which we discussed in the previous video. This only gets worse on social media, where these secret organizations know exactly what makes you the most afraid. So your phone is bombarded by some of the worst stories, which makes you realize you made the right decision to stay inside your home again. Now it gets even better, because with everyone afraid to leave their homes, we become dependent on e-commerce, with a huge bump in revenue for companies that make home security systems, or doorbell cameras, etc. Heck, a lot of people may have those smart home devices that promise safety, but really just allow these companies to monitor your movements and actions. This creates an atmosphere where people are subtly manipulated into compliance, preferring safety to freedom. Is there a dark underworld of medical care? Of course, some of you may say that even normal medical care is dark, but I'm talking about an actual underground, outside the legal limits medical care. This is what our next conspiracy alleges, called dark medicine, which basically states there is a whole underground black market of medical care mainly set up for wanted criminals. I actually first heard this conspiracy a long time ago in an episode of Batman the Animated Series called Paging the Crime Doctor, and just like it says, criminals of the underworld could not visit a standard doctor, so they instead went to one who had his license revoked, or one that is somehow being blackmailed by a criminal organization. But in our reality, the theory basically states that highly wanted criminals who may be sick and very desperate go to these hidden clinics staffed by doctors and nurses who have all had their license revoked for one reason or another. Although sometimes the conspiracy revolves around the underground trade of drugs, medical supplies, and counterfeit medicine. But the conspiracy takes a darker side when we turn to plastic surgery, because it's also suggested that some of these underground doctors are performing cosmetic surgery on some unwilling people, like anyone who has been kidnapped. Yes, this might include face reshaping, but also alterations to fingerprints and things like that. It might also include people who are trying to escape a gang or a cult, or sometimes trying to escape traffickers themselves. The theory also elaborates that sometimes law enforcement knows this and turns a blind eye, or that some powerful group of elites are wanting to do away with these people. And that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.